Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I am someone also who really believes in the potency of literature, and I have turned to literature mostly since I was in college, actually, but since I was a tiny child also. My intensity in reading really kicked in college, frankly, because I was very anxious, and reading provided like a literally almost narcotizing kind of solace for me. But I absolutely believe that literature can console, I believe it can edify, I believe it can entertain, and I believe it can offer escape. And right now, as I mentioned in the last lecture, I am really looking to literature for an escape. And sometimes when I have this desire to escape, I really hanker for just a really, really long book. And Don Quixote is nothing if not very, very long. I'm going to confess to you right now that I only read the first part. Again, this time, I have read this book many, many times. In fact, that book, as you also can imagine, is such a giant piece of literature in any study of Spanish literature that when I sat for my master's exams, I literally didn't really study it that hard. I had read it, but I hadn't really, really studied it like in a class. And I was like, there's no way they're going to ask about the Quijote because it's just like too big. It's like too obvious. And then, of course, the main question was on Quijote. And it was not great. It was not my best performance. Happy to say that I did, in fact, pass the exam with honestly like renewed respect for the book. So why is this book the one that we are diving into, and why is it that you should be listening to however long this lecture is going to go? I have a feeling this might be kind of a long one. So what I will say is that this is a book of huge importance. It was written 400 years ago, but 400 years later, it is so alive in the imagination of so many different countries all around the world. It is in fact the most translated book after the Bible. And I actually don't have the number of copies sold, but partially because that number is very hard to find because this is a book that is 400 years old. And, certainly many, many copies were sold even before we were keeping good records. We do know, and we're going to get to this, that it was an instant success and was translated right away into English, like within a couple of years, and translated into many other languages, and was what we would think of today as just a huge bestseller. So it was published in 1605, the first part. The second part was published in 1615. So this is a time, Shakespeare is publishing things like Macbeth and Hamlet right around the same time. They are, in fact, contemporaries. And many scholars, Harold Bloom sort of most principally among them, sees Don Quixote as the most important novel in any language, and puts Don Quixote as a character and as a book on par with Hamlet. And I like that comparison in many ways, but I would argue, in fact, that Don Quixote is, in fact, a bit more alive in our consciousness, partially because he's a bit of a buffoon, a bit of a dreamer, bit of an underdog, bit of a hero. It's also very funny, and it was written in language that everyone could understand. And frankly, Don Quixote is a much more adaptable story into, for example, a children's book. It's kind of hard to imagine Hamlet being in any sort of like children's book or any kind of elementary school version. And we have these words. We have quixotic in English, which means, someone who's willing to sort of risk it all for things that might be sort of silly. I also think of it as someone who's kind of whimsical and dreamy. We have the expression tilting at windmills. And absolutely, Shakespeare has given us many, many, common sayings that we are using all the time. But I really do firmly believe that this is a character and a piece of work that has really never been out of the common consciousness. In 2002, the Nobel Prize Committee asked a whole bunch of authors. There were 100 authors over 54 countries, asked them what they thought the very best novel was, and Don Quixote won by like a very large margin. It got 50% more votes than anyone else. Gabriel Garcia Marquez said of Don Quixote that it includes everything the novel will attempt. And I am going to argue today something that many people have argued. I'm going to give you a broad synthesis with a few of my own touches, that this is in fact the first modern novel. So people used to say it's the first novel. I think I've probably said it's the first novel. And in many ways it is, I think, the first novel. It is 100% the first modern novel. And what Garcia Marquez says there is alluding to that. A lot of what makes Don Quixote so remarkable, and in fact gives it such staying power, are elements that we see in the modern novel. This is a book that is on a lot of high school curricula. It is, if you ever took the AP Spanish literature, it is certainly the base of that. It is a book that when there were prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, this was a book that they requested to read. Ariel Dorfman, who's a very important Latin American writer, he describes the most amazing thing during the coup that ousted Allende in 1973 in Chile. He talks about being in that embassy and a group of people getting together and reading the Quijote aloud because it was such a crucial touch point to give them hope and to give them solace. Ariel Dorfman says this about the Quijote. Instead of a rancorous indictment of a Spain that had rejected and censored him, Cervantes invented a tour de force as playful and ironic as it was multifaceted, laying the ground for all the wild experiments the novelistic genre was to undergo. And the one thing that I will say today, I mean, this is a real celebration of Don Quixote, but you will have noticed, in fact, that the title of this lecture is essentially like, you don't have to read this book. And I stand by that. I mean, if you're really interested, honestly, I think you can read like 50 pages of this and really get it. And it is so fun to indulge. And it is charming and funny. But in many ways, it's like, it's a little repetitive. I mean, we have Don Quixote like going out for adventures. And in each one of these adventures, he's sort of deluded. And, he thinks the windmills are a giant. And he, has a fight with them. And he gets injured. And he, has to pull himself back together. And then he goes on another thing and gets injured and has to pull himself back together. I mean, it's very repetitive in some ways. It's also so much like a dude book. It's very much, a lot of the humor is sort of crude, and you've got this like kind of dude and his sidekick, and a lot of Don Quixote's attitudes about women are, it's very much like damsel in distress kind of thing. And even a lot of the sort of the combat, he gets into, I mean, in fact, all the time he's getting into these fights and he's like being pummeled and he's jousting. I mean, he's usually jousting like a herd of sheep or something like that. But there's this sense of violence and action that I think is maybe kind of male. So what I think is excellent, I mean, I don't know, maybe read an excerpt. You could watch that movie. I actually haven't watched it. I have it all queued up. The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. It's that one with Adam Driver and Richard Price. I think that's his name. My point is that it's really interesting to think about what this first modern novel is. Like, what is it that the novel really is all about? But I'm going to say something totally blasphemous here, which is I'm not necessarily recommending that you dive into like the 1,000 pages of Don Quixote. So it is just largely accepted that this is a hugely important book. It is one, obviously, I mean, I could talk for weeks and weeks about this book alone. I'm not going to do that today. In fact, this is a good time to just dive right into our agenda. We're going to do a brief but very crucial bio of Cervantes. Then we're going to talk about why this book was so radically innovative. We're going to situate it a little bit as a new form. We're going to talk about what came before. And then we're going to dive a little deeper into the elements that really do make this the first modern novel. We're going to talk about the form of the book, the narrator, the various authors of the book. Yes, plural, authors. We're going to talk about interiority and how Don Quixote is one of the very first characters where we understand his thoughts and feelings in a kind of radical way. We're going to talk about something called heteroglossia, which was coined by Bakhtin, who is a Russian literary theorist. It basically just means that there are lots and lots of different registers, lots of different types of language that Cervantes is using, which was also hugely innovative and something that the modern novel would go on to use in really important ways. We're going to talk about dialogue and how dialogue in the novel was a new thing. We're going to talk about the radical sort of meta stuff that is happening. This is a book that is very overtly concerned with its own being. It is a book where we hear a lot about where the book was found, where the manuscript came from, who translated it, who the authors are. And a lot of that actually went sort of underground, which we're going to talk about, and then kind of popped back up in the middle of the 20th century. It's honestly one of the things about the book that I'm most impressed with. I love all of this meta stuff, and we're going to look at how well it functions. I mentioned this before, and this is not exactly an element of form, but this is a satire. And the modern novel, in lots of ways, there's lots and lots of satire. I mean, it's a very important piece of literature. It's not an entirely new thing. There are elements of the Canterbury Tales that are sort of satirical. But to write an entire, pair of novels that is really steeped in satire was, in fact, innovative in a way that was important. And lastly, the one element that the modern novel really developed, again, is this idea of metafiction, which we will get to. We're going to finish up the analysis of why this is a modern novel with the portrayal of a few of the women in the book. And all throughout the whole thing, we're going to be talking about the notion of satire. We're going to then very quickly talk about the novels that came after the Quixote. So again, it was published in 1605 and 1615, and things changed. We went through the Enlightenment, and then we went through the Romantic stuff in the beginning of the 19th century. And so it really wasn't until, the way that I think about it, really wasn't until the publication of Madame Bovary and the rise of the realist novel. Then we have modernism, then we have postmodernism. So Cervantes essentially introduced the idea of the modern novel, and then no one really elaborated it in super meaningful ways, for several hundred years. So we're going to talk briefly about authors who were very deeply influenced by this novel. Okay, diving in with this crucial but very brief biography. Miguel de Cervantes y Saavedra was born in 1547 in Spain, died in 1616. He was a soldier. He was a prisoner in Algiers. He, at one point, was held for ransom and was in fact ransomed and came back to Spain and was put in prison again. In fact, at that point, it was for like some sort of financial thing. People thought it was because he was like this radical kind of firebrand guy, but in fact, it had to do with like taxes or something or some sort of fiscal thing that he was not handling very responsibly. He then himself was a tax collector, and the reason why that's notable is because he would travel all around Spain, much the way that Don Quixote does, and he saw a lot of different elements of the country and really had a pretty vivid image of what Spain was like in the end of its golden age. So it's important to situate him a little bit here too in the history. So if you think about Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the Catholic kings, well, not kings, that's what you would say in Spanish, los reyes católicos. So the Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, they're the ones who are responsible. Their era, their reign was during, 1492, when we had what in the United States we consider sort of a seminal year for all of the kind of exploring that was going on from Spain. They had a huge navy. They were a very powerful military force. And one of the things that was happening is these Catholic kings were consolidating power for the Catholics and taking it away from the aristocracy. So there was a lot happening in Spain. Things were shifting a lot. And one of the things the book does so well is it really is a skewering of this time period when Cervantes was living. To situate a little more in history, 1588 was the sinking of the Spanish Armada. And that, for me, signals, sort of the end of their imperial era. And during this whole time, you're having the Inquisition. So there is a lot happening in Spain. And all of that is incredible grist for Cervantes' mill. He did have a daughter out of wedlock. He also married someone who was his daughter's age. And very importantly, he was a failed poet and playwright. So for most of his life, he was writing in sort of different genres and trying to be professionally successful, and was not, in fact, until the very end of his life. And as I noted before, Don Quixote de la Mancha was an instant success. Right away, people recognized its genius. One thing that was also very important is the printing press. That's 14 something or other. So essentially, 150 years before the Quixote is written, it is the printing press, in fact, allowed it to be disseminated in ways that really allowed for its popularity. It was translated right away, as I mentioned, into English and lots of other languages. It was a very interesting phenomenon that was happening too. All of the kind of important writing was happening in Italy and France and Spain, and it would make its way northward. In fact, Shakespeare wrote a play called Cardenio. Well, I guess Cardenio, you would say in English. So we know, in fact, that Shakespeare knew of of Cervantes, but in fact, Cervantes would not necessarily have known about Shakespeare. Bit of an open question there. And in terms of the publication, we know it was an instant success, but it was also kind of an amazing story. He publishes the first part in 1605, and in it promises a second part, but doesn't, in fact, write a second part. He's kind of an old man at this point. He's going to be like sort of in his 60s. I can't really do that math. Maybe late 50s, early 60s, which would have been, pretty old for that era. So what happens is that this other guy writes a sequel to Don Quixote, and it actually gets quite a bit of traction. And so Cervantes is like, wait, what? That is not my book. I didn't have anything to do with this. So he's sort of forced to write this second part. And lots of what is so engaging about the book is this second part of Don Quixote refers a lot to the first part, and it also refers to this apocryphal version. And I think a lot of that gets forgotten if people ever knew it from the first place. But this is such a remarkable book that even, to me, even the circumstances of its publication are totally fascinating. I would, in fact, like to do a much deeper dive into the circumstances of the publication, because this was such a crazy satire. Really nothing was sacred. And if you think about Spain during the Inquisition, this is not a forgiving kind of government that was in charge of Spain at the time. So I mentioned before that the Catholics are consolidating power. Cervantes is not afraid to skewer that. He talks about the poverty that was really difficult in lots of parts of Spain. He also goes after kind of the system of justice, the way, I mean, as a former prisoner and someone who was ransomed and someone who had served his country and then was not, in fact, compensated super well. All of that stuff comes under fire. There are references to the Inquisition, and in many ways, Spain sort of like clinging to its golden age. So one of the ways that this thing is really, really bold is, in fact, the way that it's satirizing everything. So I think a good number of people have this idea in mind that Don Quixote is a send-up, kind of a spoof of the chivalric novel. So in many ways, we can mark it as the first modern novel because it is reflecting upon what has come before it. So it's important, if it's kind of the first of something, it's important to understand what went before. So first, of course, you can think, I mean, in many ways, this is the Western canon, and I apologize up front that this is like a very Eurocentric kind of lecture. It is the way that I was educated in many ways, for better and for worse. There are very good arguments that the first novel was, in fact, The Tale of Genji, the Japanese novel. But we're just going to have to stick with the way that I see the Quixote in this trajectory of literature. So if we go way back to the classics, we have, things like Ovid and Homer, and we have the Odyssey. And those, of course, were epics that were written in poetry. I mean, these things they're poems, essentially. You think of Dante and the Inferno, that's a poem. You also had drama at that point. You had things like Antigone. So you have all of these really important classic works, but they were not, in fact, written in prose the way that Don Quixote was. Later, we have the Italian novella. So also, still kind of in the Aegean Sea in Italy there, we have these novellas, these kind of shorter stories that are, in fact, starting to be written in prose. And importantly, in both France and in Spain, we have the rise of the chivalric novel. So I think for a lot of English speakers and a lot of Americans, a really good, sort of touch point and example of the chivalric novel is the idea of King Arthur. Certainly once Guinevere sort of enters the picture and we have him as this kind of knight crusading against all sorts of stuff. So importantly, that whole piece of literature was based on King Arthur, who may or may not have actually been a historical figure, but is largely held to be a historical figure, who was in England in the sort of 5th and 6th centuries. The story itself was written in the 1100s, in the 12th century, so think medieval era, by a French guy. And right around that same time in France, we have the Song of Roland, and we also have the Romance of the Rose. So these are written in kind of the 1100s and 1200s. Not too much later, we have Amadís de Gaula, which is a Spanish chivalric novel, and it was published in 1508. We also have Orlando Furioso, which was published, sort of 1506 to 1532. These are kind of approximate dates. So the main takeaway here is that there were all of these works that were being written about chivalry, about knights. And one of the things that for me is most salient is these things were a mixture of prose and poetry. So there's lots and lots of poetry in them. And one of the reasons why they needed so much poetry is this is before the printing press. So you might have a lot of people, copying them out, scribes who are writing these things, but a lot of it needed to be told orally, which is why you would want a lot of poetry. You would want a lot of, things that were rhyming and had cadence. And so you could, maybe you even sing them like a song. So it makes a lot of sense that before the printing press, a lot of fiction would have been written in poetic form. For me, the other thing that's important about these books, I will be the first to admit I was not a medievalist when I was in graduate school. This was not an era that was super enticing to me. I did not read a lot of these pieces of literature. I certainly read excerpts to understand them, but this was not my passion. But it's very well established that these are works that are sort of taken at face value. They were certainly formulaic. They were all involving, damsels in distress and knights coming and vanquishing dragons and all of the things that you think about when you think about knights. So if we think of Amadís de Gaula, which is one of the books that Cervantes is in fact referring to in Don Quixote, or Orlando Furioso, these are books that were written in the century right before Don Quixote was written. And they are very much the subject of the satire that Cervantes delivers. So now we're going to dive into the many ways that Don Quixote can be considered the first modern novel. So for me, the most sort of standout one, the most kind of obvious one, is the idea of the form. So it is, in fact, a book that is mostly prose. I mean, it is very, very long. And what little poetry there is, it all comes at the beginning. And it's very clear that the only reason these poems are included is because if it's going to be a book about chivalry, which is, in fact, the goal, you have to have these sonnets that come at the beginning that are introducing the reader to the characters and to their plight. But even there, we have a satirization of the poems that are taken very seriously in the original chivalric novels. So the vast majority of the work is prose, and what poetry there is all kind of upfront and very silly in lots of ways. Another element that was radically different is the idea of dialogue. So in the way that we think about the modern novel, you have quotation marks that set off when someone is speaking to someone else. That was a brand new thing. I mean, it is so revolutionary when you just think about dialogue. I mean, obviously, it's not only just two people speaking. You can, in fact, have a large group of people, and all of those voices are heard, which is so crazy. I mean, if you're writing about King Arthur, it's the narrator's voice that you're hearing, and essentially just that, and it's a poem. Here we have prose, and in that prose, we are hearing all of these different voices. It also is the source of lots and lots of humor in the book. It is some of the most ingenious kind of craftsmanship. I mean, Cervantes had an incredible, incredible ear and was able to bring all sorts of walks of life, all different classes. We have a priest, we have a barber, we have lots of shepherds. We have all of these different people, and all of them are speaking in ways that are very specific to either their jobs or their social standing. It's an absolutely miraculous thing that he is doing. And the fact that he even has dialogue among people is totally crazy in the sense of it being brand new. So the other thing about this is it's written in the vernacular. And the vernacular, it just means like it's not written in Latin, or Greek. But even more so, vernacular just speaks to the idea of common language. So this was written in a Spanish, in the beginning of the 16th century, that would have been spoken by everyone around. This is not poetry. It is simply the vernacular, which in itself is really innovative and interesting. There also is this very interesting thing. Anyone who's spent time in Spain or speaks much Spanish knows that there is something called the Academia Real, which is like the Royal Academy. And it is the whole point of it is to keep Spanish pure, to sort of, which is, so crazy and so kind of colonial in lots of ways. But this idea of wanting to keep the language a certain way is a very, very important part of Spain and sort of the nationality of Spain. So one of the things that happens is this novel that is written in 1605 and 1615, that Spanish is much closer to the Spanish that is spoken today than, for example, Shakespearean English is to English speakers of today. So English is totally known for being this very flexible language that is constantly evolving and is really always, sucking in all of these other languages and borrowing all sorts of stuff. There's lots of German, there's all the Romance stuff. We have all the Anglo-Saxon stuff. It's a very flexible language that in fact thrives on innovation. That is not the case with Spanish. So the beautiful thing about that is that Don Quixote, when you read it, if you read it in Spanish, it really, it feels sort of quaint and it feels somewhat arcane, but it is certainly more accessible than Shakespearean English. The novel, in fact, we're going to talk about this in a bit. It is, in fact, very interested in translation, the novel itself. So, in fact, I'll tip my hand right now. When our narrator, the person, there's a very specific person who is narrating this novel, he at one point says that he found the manuscript on like a dusty table of all these old books, and that it was written in Arabic, and that he needed to find someone, in fact, to translate it. So this is a novel that is very concerned with translation, and I am fascinated with all of the different translations that there are of Don Quixote. So a lot of people these days are reading the Edith Grossman one. I love her translation. It came out in the early aughts, I think. But she talks about making this very specific choice, which is not to try to, translate all of the 17th century Spanish. She, in fact, wanted to have, readers of English feel the same way that someone who was Spanish would feel when they were reading it in 1605. So she makes a decision to put it in relatively modern English, which I actually think is awesome. Part of the reason why I like that is because if you look, it's so cool to look at translations of the Quixote because, there are many of them over many, many centuries. And what happens, of course, is when you look at them at different points in time, they're all by men. And those men at those different points in time are using, well, sometimes they're using sort of a more arcane English, but it totally varies person to person. Some of them are much more flowery. Some of them try to be closer to the language of Cervantes. But I love the idea of Edith. I think in many ways it makes it so accessible for people because it feels very now. And I mean, it doesn't feel now. That's not quite true because, in fact, we have Don Quixote and Sancho Panza at different points speaking in this kind of high-flown chivalric language as if they were like King Arthur. But a lot of the language feels very contemporary. So one of the things that the modern novel is really going to capitalize on is the narrative stance in the Quixote. So we talk a lot in the Fox page about narrative stance. It's simply the way that the story is told, whether or not you have an omniscient narrator who's kind of invisible and who knows everything, or whether it's kind of a limited third person, or whether it's first person, I did this, I did that. The narrative stance in this book is incredible. What we have essentially is, technically it is a first person narrative in many ways because we have someone who is saying like, I found this manuscript and I'm going to tell you a story. But that first person is very limited. That person doesn't sort of pop up very often, but it does this incredible intimate thing where as soon as you say, I'm going to tell you about this whole thing, it's incredible because it assumes a you. It assumes that we have a narrator and that narrator is talking to someone. And in fact, that someone is the reader, the person who's holding the book. So I love first person narration when it's kind of a framework. And I like it. One of my favorite first person narrators is when they then kind of disappear and it sort of feels like a third person narrator. So we're going to look at the very beginning. We're not going to read a ton of the text, although it is so delightful to sink into that we are going to take a look at a couple of times when we see this narrator and also a couple of times when Cervantes is playing with the idea of the author. Okay, so we are going to look at part 1 of The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote de la Mancha. So we have chapter 1, and then we have all those funny little summaries that come at the beginning of the little thing, which is just such a funny thing to me that like it's the sort of thing that says chapter 1, which describes the condition and profession of the famous gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. So then we get into the real text. Somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember, a gentleman lived not long ago, one of those who has a lance, an ancient shield on a shelf, and keeps a skinny nag and a greyhound for racing. So we know that he is someone who is of some social standing. He enjoys hunting. He has a horse. He has, in fact, fallen on harder times. He also is a man of leisure. We know that the person who is the subject of the novel is someone who spends an enormous amount of time reading. We don't know that quite yet, but we're about to find that out. And has a very, very vast library. So clearly this is someone who has enough means to be sort of a leisurely person. But the thing that I want to focus on right now is this idea of somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember. We have this I right away. We also have this narrator who's pretty irreverent. So La Mancha, another important thing, La Mancha it's like a big part of Spain that's very arid. It's not particularly like beautiful. I was thinking earlier, like what I could compare it to in the United States, and I was like, I'm going to offend anyone that I try to compare it to. So I'm not going to risk offending anyone. But the trick here, the thing that's interesting is like normally one of these chivalric novels would have been set, in Avalon or one of these like kind of momentous, beautiful places with lots of like cliffs and crags and the ocean and castles and whatnot. And La Mancha is this flat, arid, dry place that is not any of those things. So we have this idea of somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember. We have this idea, some people call him an unreliable narrator, and I don't really think that's how I conceive of it, but it is someone who's a little cheeky and someone who is going to be very picky about about the story that he is going to tell. I assume it's a he because honestly, like everybody's a he at this point. So then the book does this amazing thing which actually presages the idea of the realist novel, which is Madame Bovary is the realist novel. The next sort of era, when I think the novel truly comes to the fore, we have Jane Austen and we have like things like Dangerous Liaison. We have a couple of things in the 18th century, but really it's the middle of the 19th century where we see the realist novel emerge. And famously, one of Flaubert's main ideas in Madame Bovary, which is the quintessential realist novel, is to include everything. He wanted to include what people were eating and where they went to the bathroom, instead of these novels that were very sort of sanitized and kind of idealized. But very quickly here, we move from finding out about this gentleman to this idea of what he eats. An occasional stew, beef more often than lamb, hash most nights, eggs and abstinence on Saturdays, lentils on Fridays, sometimes squab as a treat on Sundays. These consume 3/4 of his income. So we know, in fact, that he is someone who's fallen. Beef at that point would have been less expensive than lamb. But what's interesting here is we have this very detailed sense of what's happening in his life. That is tipping the hand that this is a novel that is full of detail. Instead of the chivalric novel, which would have described, heroic deeds and would have given very kind of cliche description of what the damsel in distress looked like. This is a novel that's going to really provide detail, that's going to give us this incredibly vivid and often very crude vision of the life of this gentleman. So if we go down a little further, and I want to focus here again on this idea of this I, this first person. And first person singular, of course, is I, but first person plural is we. So what happens here is he starts using the first person plural, this we, which makes the intimacy with the reader, all the more sort of tangible. So we have this. Our gentleman was approximately 50 years old. His complexion was weathered, his flesh scrawny, his face gaunt, and he was a very early riser and a great lover of the hunt. Some claim that his family name was Quijada or Quejada, for there is a certain amount of disagreement among the authors who write of this matter, although reliable conjecture seems to indicate that his name was Quijana. But this does not matter very much to our story. In its telling, there is absolutely no deviation from the truth. This is so crazy. It's insane to me how innovative this is. So we have the intimacy with our narrator. He's saying our story this and our gentleman this. Then he's talking about all of the people who are writing about the Quixote. So you have this idea of like the scholarship that is going to grow out of this. And what that does is it makes us think that this is like a real thing. This is a real piece of history that is talking about a real person who has a real name. And what's funny is that we find out soon that the name of Don Quixote de la Mancha, his actual name is Alonso Quijano, and all of the names that they mention here in the beginning are not true. So at the end, he says everything that is in this book is absolutely 100% true, but he has also just given us 3 names that do not, in fact, describe our protagonist. Very quickly, in terms of the names, when you think of Alonso Quijano, you can hear, if you speak Spanish or you know any Spanish, quejarse is to complain about something. And anytime you have like the X, like if it's quejana, we would say quejana now, but back in this stage, Spanish was still kind of, the X might have been pronounced more like a sh, like a quejano. And then that gets kind of closer to the idea of cheese. So the important thing here is that the last name of this Alonso character has these kind of evocations of either complaining or of cheese. So right from the start, you have this idea of this farce where we have the idea of this, this gentleman who loved the hunt, and yet his name is associated with things that are not, in fact, very elevated. So I want to look at one more time when we have the narrator really as sort of front and center. And there are not too many of these where the narrator actually it becomes sort of a character in the novel, where we really see him as a whole entire person. So on page 66, we have this. Don Quixote is deserving of continual and memorable praise, as am I, on account of the toil and effort I have put into finding the conclusion of this amiable history. Though I know very well that if heaven, circumstances, and fortune do not assist me, the world will be deprived of the almost 2 hours of entertainment and pleasure the attentive reader may derive from it. Which is hilarious because obviously this book takes a lot longer than 2 hours. There is so much humor in the book. Some of it's like total dad joke, and there's actually a lot of slapstick in this book that I do not love. But there's also a lot of incredibly clever humor. And I actually found this kind of funny. I was like, 2 hours? I mean, my God, look at the size of this sucker. If you're on YouTube, you're just, you're really getting an eyeful here. So after he's talking about how the world might have been deprived of these 2 hours of entertainment if he, this narrator, who's now a character in the book, had not in fact found it. And then he goes on to tell us this very interesting story. This is how I happened to find it. One day, when I was in the Alcalá market in Toledo, a boy came to sell some notebooks and old papers to a silk merchant. As I am very fond of reading, even torn papers in the street, I was moved by my natural inclinations to pick up one of the volumes the boy was selling, and I saw that it was written in characters I knew to be Arabic. And since I recognized but could not read it, I looked around to see if some Morisco, who knew Castilian and who could read it for me, was in the vicinity. And it was not very difficult to find this kind of interpreter, for even if I had sought a speaker of a better and older language, I would have found him. In short, fortune provided me with one, and when I told him what I wanted and placed the book in his hands, he opened it in the middle. So a couple of things here that are important. Very brief interlude about Spanish history. The Moors who came up from Africa they came up into Spain and were in control of Spain from 711 to 1492. That was literally like my favorite thing to memorize back when you had to memorize things when I was in graduate school, because 711 was so easy for me because of like the stores, and then 1492 literally because we learned that in like second grade or whatever. So the era in which the Moors controlled Spain is very clear in my head. 1492, again, we have, the Catholic kings expel all of the Moors, and we have the Reconquest. So when this narrator is talking about this book having been written in Arabic originally, it's a little bit of a slight. So there would have been some ethnic tension between, the Spaniards, who were of more northern European descent, versus the Moors, who had come up from Africa and who had been in charge of Spain, or not in charge, who had occupied and who ruled Spain for a long, long time. So even the idea, in the same way that Don Quixote's name is not very lofty, it's also kind of a little bit of a jab here that this is written originally in Arabic. But this next part is so incredible to me. I loved this so much. It's so telling. And again, we're kind of at the beginning of the story. We're at page 67, which is, in some novels you'd be like halfway through, but not this one. But we have the idea of this person who is beginning to translate this work for our narrator, and it is so vivid. And the beginnings of like the narrator working with the novel are so vivid here. So there's the part where he says fortune provided him with a translator, and when I told him what I wanted and placed the book in his hands, he opened it in the middle, read for a short while, and began to laugh. So amazing. So it's so vivid. And then he goes on, I asked him why he was laughing, and he replied that it was because of something written in the margin of the book as an annotation. I told him to tell me what it was, and he, still laughing, said, as I have said, here in the margin is written, this Dulcinea of Toboso, referred to so often in the history, they say had the best hand for salting pork of any woman in all of La Mancha. So this is so incredible. First of all, it's incredibly complex. You have the idea of a manuscript that is written in Arabic, and then you have marginalia. You have an idea of multiple authors. We have the idea of this story, the story of Don Quixote. So we have it written by someone in Arabic, but we also have another person who is in fact supplying more details for the story. It's so incredible the way that we are learning about this manuscript. This is entirely innovative in 1605. And then we have this amazing, thing. So Dulcinea is, of course, it's like the Guinevere of Don Quixote. This is, this woman who he holds in reverence, who is in fact a peasant. And right from the start, we have this guy kind of chuckling when he is reading, in fact, that what she's really good at is salting pork. It's incredible. And just to close this idea of this kind of meta thing where we are seeing this narrator who is coming into first contact with the manuscript, a little further down we have, in fact, the title that includes the idea of this author, this original author. I urged him to read the beginning, which he did, extemporizing a translation of the Arabic into Castilian, and saying that it said, History of Don Quixote of La Mancha, written by Cid Hamete Benengeli, an Arab historian. So this is so incredible. Also it's a historian. So we had earlier this idea, the narrator saying everything here is true. Now we have the idea that this is a history, which is really this crazy thing. Where we have someone playing with the idea of fact and fiction and reality and fiction. There are reams of scholarship that have been written about the nature and honestly, they're entire branches of philosophy. There's this idea of perspectivism. There's all of this stuff that is deeply involved with this book because it is challenging the idea of what is real and what is imagined. So the idea of history and the idea of an Arab historian as being the person who is writing down this actual story about Don Quixote is an incredible way, it's this crazy premise to include in the novel itself. So if that were not authors enough, we also have mention of Cervantes himself. So this is when, this is that amazing part where we have the neighbors who are trying to get rid of all of Don Quixote's books because they are in fact so dangerous. One of the points that is made, and I'm not going to talk about it too much today because in some ways it seems so obvious, this is a book that is entirely about the idea of reading. It's about the force of reading. It's literally someone who goes crazy and changes his whole entire life because reading has altered him so much. This is a book that is entirely caught up in this idea of the potency of literature. And we see it very clearly when all of the neighbors of Alonso go to his house and are like, oh my God, we've got to get rid of all these books. They're totally changing his brain. So at the end of that section, on page 52, we have this. And this is a dialogue. Again, here we have this dialogue between the priest and the barber. The barber begins. La Galatea by Miguel de Cervantes, said the barber. This Cervantes has been a good friend of mine for many years, and I know that he is better versed in misfortunes than in verses. His book has a certain creativity. It proposes something and concludes nothing. We have to wait for the second part he has promised. Perhaps with that addition it will achieve the mercy denied to it now. In the meantime, keep it locked away in your house, my friend. So the Galatea is something that Cervantes wrote. This is a book that was obviously not nearly as successful as the Quijote. But we also have this idea here, this allusion to a promised second volume, which again it's so meta in the sense that it's talking here about the author who is not the fictional author. He's like the actual author of the book. And this idea of this second volume, I also love the idea of how self-deprecating it is. It says here, his book has a certain creativity. It proposes something and concludes nothing. This is the kind of humor I really enjoy. I mean, it's a little bit like almost dad jokey kind of. It's a little kind of silly. But I really love the idea of self-deprecation. And it's also speaking to what we are expecting. We are expecting, that a work of fiction would propose something and that it would conclude something. So even when we are having the humor, we're playing with the idea of what fiction is and how it functions. Before we move away from this idea of authorship, I want to just point out that this idea of these multiple authors and the idea of questioning, like, who is the author and who is the narrator and how do they function together, this is something that the novel later becomes really deeply preoccupied with. And one of the most famous examples of this is Borges, who's an important Argentine writer, who in 1939, writes a short story called Pierre Menard, author of the Quijote. So we have this idea of an entirely, this is someone who's going to sort of rewrite the whole thing, which is very Borgesian. Borges is always, everything is very meta, this idea of like, what is fiction and what are the bounds of fiction? So you have this idea of this person who's essentially going to write it again because it has been translated and it has been written all of these different times. There's a certain amount of scholarship about the fact that that's a very colonial and in fact sort of post-colonial or like beginning to be post-colonial sense in that Borges is taking something that is from peninsular Spain and essentially making it his own, making a Latin American version of it. It's a really complicated and really interesting piece of literature. And the important thing there is just to note that this book from 1605 is the one that is sort of spawning very, very important literature 300 years later. So now that we've covered the idea of the narrator and all of these multiple authors and the idea of playing with the idea of authorship, we're going to move on to another element of why this is known, why this makes the claim of being the first modern novel. And that is the idea of satire. So I've spoken already about all of the things that were happening in Spain. So a brief, kind of description of satire is that it's often an exaggeration of a societal ill in order to sort of want to correct that ill. So, a lot of the slapstick stuff, a lot of the humor in Don Quixote, honestly, like so much of the book has to do with exaggeration. It's a really violent book. People are just getting absolutely pummeled and then are sort of poured back onto their horse and sent off and then they get better. But this idea of exaggeration is one of the main ways that we see the satire. And that would not, you could argue that that's happening in the chivalric novel, but it's not in the same way. It's not so overblown that it's very obviously a satire. We also have lots of irony in this book. And honestly, the bulk of it is this idea of this kind of, somewhat down on his luck, readerly, kind of old nobody in the middle of nowhere in Spain as being a knight. There's lots of irony just in that. But one of the kind of subcategories of irony that I love the most is something called dramatic irony. And it's simply the idea that the reader has information that someone in the book does not. And this is a book where dramatic irony, the reader has information that Don Quixote does not. But the beautiful thing is that lots of the other characters also have information that Don Quixote does not. They all know that he is Alonso Quijana. I think I've been saying Quijano. I think it's Quijana. They all have this information that he does not. So when he's talking about being a knight errant, and when he's talking about how he can't, sleep at night in the inn because he has to like keep guard from atop the battlements when, in fact, he's just like in a little courtyard, they're all kind of humoring him. And the reason why that is so entertaining is because they know he's not a knight errant, and the reader knows they know he's not a knight errant. So a lot of what is sort of charming in the book comes from the fact that lots of people are kind of in on the joke, which is kind of a loose way to think about dramatic irony. The last thing I'll say about the satire, too, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but there are so many times in this book where there are kind of these winks to the reader, and there's a lot of warmth in the book. There's some of it's very cruel, but a lot of it, especially with the humor, there's like this kind of warm-heartedness to the whole thing. So I think if it were like a super biting satire, and certainly we have lots of those and they have not endured in the same way, there's a warmth to the satire here and a humor to the satire that I think makes it much more palatable. The next thing that we're going to talk about that is like this incredible innovation in this novel and that we see developed later is this idea of interiority. So when you had, if you look at like the Decameron, or we look at the Divine Comedy, or we look at, the Odyssey, those are not books that are telling us a lot about how these people feel. So these are people who are heroic. They're often very flat characters. They're kind of heroic from the beginning to the end. They don't really change very much. They stand for kind of one thing. They're either really villainous or they're really good. In this case, we have lots and lots of rounded characters. They're kind of a mix of good and bad, and pathetic and courageous, all of these different things. And some of that comes from the fact that we are hearing about how they are feeling. It's not in the first person. It's not Don Quixote, although there is tons and tons of Don Quixote kind of explaining how he feels in these long monologues that are delivered in this very kind of high-flown chivalric language. But we have these interludes where the author is telling us how Don Quixote feels, which is totally innovative. So on page 22, we have this. This is when he's thinking about what he's going to name, his trusty steed, who is in fact this old nag. He spent 4 days thinking about the name he would give it, for, as he told himself, it was not seemly that the horse of so famous a knight and a steed so intrinsically excellent should not have a worthy name. He was looking for the precise name that would declare what the horse had been before its master had become a knight-errant, and what it was now. For he was determined that if the master was changing his condition, the horse too would change its name to one that would win the fame and recognition its new position and profession deserved. And so, after many names that he shaped and discarded, subtracted from and added to, unmade and remade in his memory and imagination, he finally decided to call the horse Rocinante, a name, in his opinion, that was noble, sonorous, and reflective of what it had been when it was a nag, before it was what it was now, which was the foremost nag in all the world. Couple of things here about the prose. Cervantes loves synonyms. He loves to like pile up these kinds of, you'll have the same kind of concept named again and again and again. But what's really important here is we have this idea of how he's thinking about this. We have his thought process. We have this idea that this is very important to him. And, if this were in a chivalric novel, it would be something like, he decided to call his horse Rocinante. You just would have the exterior. You wouldn't have all of this deliberation. It's also amazing. I love the idea very explicitly. He's like, this is a nag, and it was a nag before, and when it transforms, it's going to have, still elements of nag, which really speaks to the idea, in fact, a very important one, the possibility of personal evolution. But here, too, it's funny because Rocin is like nag, so this would be like, I don't even know how you would do that in English, but it's like a way of sort of, aggrandizing this idea, Rocinante, which is just sort of ridiculous because you have the idea of like the most nag-ish, which is, of course, where a lot of the humor is derived. Speaking of names and Rocinante, I literally think I've been saying Alonso Quijana totally wrong this whole time. It's funny to me. That is not a name I can keep in my head. And I don't think that's like entirely my fault. In the beginning, we have all of these other names that might be the original name of Don Quixote. And it's just mentioned, it might only be mentioned once. I only have it sort of circled once in my text. So I think it's not totally egregious that I keep getting the name wrong. But we've talked a little bit about why that name is somewhat absurd. And of course, then we have Sancho Panza. So Sancho would be like a shortened name. I meant to look up what it's short for, but it's like Pancho, which is short for Francisco. You have this idea of Sancho as being, it's probably not his full name. And then Panza, which is like a pot belly. So you have, of course, the part even visually of these two people together is funny. You have a little bit of that visual humor and a little bit sort of slapsticky stuff. But the names are so indicative of how silly these titles are. But one thing I wanted to touch on quickly when we think of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, I mean, it's interesting too, like the sidekick thing was so important in this work. And that is something that has endured in all sorts of literary and in fact, many, many different sort of genres, whether it's movies or TV. There are all sorts of different times when you have this kind of pairing of people. And I think it is so interesting. The function of a sidekick like that is actually so important. So the best way to think about this is if you think of Sherlock Holmes with Watson. So we have Watson who's like, not that smart in the novels. In the television show, he is actually quite smart. I miss that show. I loved that show. But we need Watson. You can't just like talk about what Sherlock is thinking the whole time. We can't have a narrator who's just like, Sherlock saw all of these different things. We need Watson because we need someone to be like, wait, how do you know that? And like, wait, explain this to me because I don't really get it. We have to have the person that's kind of a proxy for the audience or the reader who's like, wait, what? And or even just like an object for someone to explain the things to. And Sancho Panza is largely that. He's not actually asking a ton of questions, although he does. And lots of people in the book are like, wait, you are not a knight errant. You are, in fact, like just a person, just a gentleman who lives here in La Mancha with all the rest of us in this very modern day of 1605. But what we need is this Sancho Panza, who is basically like someone who Don Quixote can talk at. So Don Quixote is describing like all the important elements of the chivalric code and how, you don't get to sleep at night because you have to be guarding everyone and how you have to do things in a certain way and you have to have all of these different accoutrements. It's important that we have Sancho Panza, who is like a repository and an audience. It also, one of the very important things in this book is the idea of the different registers. So we talked earlier about this idea of heteroglossia, which is simply all of these different registers. We have Sancho Panza, who is, he's not very educated. He, in fact, can't read. So he is someone who has not had a lot of exposure to the chivalric novels. But a lot of the language that Don Quixote is using is this kind of high-flown language. And, in this English translation, you can absolutely hear it. I mean, he's talking in this language that seems very arcane. In the Spanish, it's the same. You have most of the prose is written in what would have been, sort of everyday Spanish of 1605. And then you have Don Quixote speaking in this entirely different register. And one of the things that is so funny is Sancho Panza is also trying to speak in that register occasionally, but he often makes these little mistakes that are, often a pun or something that's kind of close but sounds absurd. So the idea of the sidekick, who is also someone who's a little bit of a funhouse mirror for our Don Quixote, because he's showing how absurd the use of this language is. There are many, many ways in which this kind of sidekick thing is really important. And it's so crazy to think that this is something, I mean, maybe we had them in the chivalric novels too, but we were not using them in the chivalric novels to do all of the different stuff that Cervantes is having Sancho Panza do. The last kind of discrete element that we are going to talk about in the book that provides kind of seeds that grow into the modern novel is this idea of women in the book. This is not an exhaustive reading. I just want to look at one character, actually at two characters, because the treatment of women in the novel is so interesting. Keep in mind as we dive into this that the women in the chivalric novels are entirely helpless. They are damsels in distress. The only thing they do is function as these very like chaste and like beautiful, like conventionally beautiful and sort of pure and like very blank vessels that the knights get to sort of put all of their ideas of love and romance into, but the women themselves have very, very little substance. That is not the case for the women in this book. So right at the beginning, it's not the beginning, but it feels like the beginning. It's about page 100. In this copy, it is 98 and 99. We have this idea of Marcela. So Marcela is the object of affection of the guy who killed himself, and they're having to bury, and there's all sorts of slapstick that goes along. But he killed himself because of his unrequited love of Marcela, and she's being somewhat villainized. But then we have Marcella herself emerge in the novel in a way that you never would have seen in the chivalric works. And what she says is incredible. I mean, it's insane that she even has any kind of voice at all. But again, the fact that we have so much dialogue and we have all of these different registers and we can hear all these people so well allows us to really hear the voice of a woman in this era, which is, that itself is amazing. But then what she says is just absolutely incredible. So on pages 98 and 99, so she says this: "I do not come, O Ambrosio, for any of the causes you have mentioned," Marcella responded, "but I return here on my own behalf to explain how unreasonable are those who in their grief blame me for the death of Grisostomo. And so I beg all those present to hear me, for there will be no need to spend much time or waste many words to persuade discerning men of the truth." I mean, I think it's like a little wishful thinking there. Which actually is part of again, like this is part of the joke. Like I said that in a very kind of straight way, but that's part of why this is funny. I mean, these men are going to be very difficult for her to convince. And, the fact that she's like, "Oh, I'm sure you're going to understand this," really underscores the fact that they're pretty bigoted and chauvinistic and narrow-minded. So she goes on to say this: "Heaven made me, as all of you say, so beautiful that you cannot resist my beauty and are compelled to love me. And because of the love you show me, you claim that I am obliged to love you in return. I know, with the natural understanding that God has given me, that everything beautiful is lovable, but I cannot grasp why, simply because it is loved, the thing loved for its beauty is obliged to love the one who loves it." I mean, incredible, incredible. She's like, just because you think I'm beautiful and just because you fall in love with me, that has nothing to do with what I want out of life. And that's not even the end. I mean, here we go. There's more. "Further, the lover of the beautiful thing might be ugly, and since ugliness is worthy of being avoided, it is absurd for anyone to say, 'I love you because you are beautiful. You must love me even though I am ugly.' But in the event that the two are equally beautiful, it does not mean that their desires are necessarily equal, for not all beauties fall in love. Some are a pleasure to the eye, but do not surrender their will, because if all beauties loved and surrendered, there would be a whirl of confused and misled wills, not knowing where they should stop. For since beautiful subjects are infinite, desires would have to be infinite too." So one of the things that's crucial about the book that, honestly, I should have a whole section on the philosophy that this book spawns, but one of the things is reality versus like dreaminess versus fiction. But another thing is this idea of free will, this idea of how much people can change. And what we have here is Marcella not only giving us a very convincing look at all the reasons why women should not be obliged to do anything they don't want to do, we also have this idea of free will. A couple of quick things here. It is so amazing to me when she says so clearly, "I cannot grasp why, simply because it is loved, the thing loved for its beauty is obliged to love the one who loves it." The idea of "I cannot grasp," and then down here a little, "it is absurd for anyone to say." It's so, she has so much potency. It's so strong. A little further down, she talks about surrendering her will. This is someone who has in fact, gone out into nature and she wants to just be left by herself. She's happy to just be on her own. She's like this incredible embodiment, not only of like rejecting the idea of compulsory marriage, but also just this idea of someone who's happy to be by herself and who really is not interested in bending to the will of men around her. A little later, we have another sort of minor character. Well, she's like kind of a, medium character. But she's this woman who is like incredibly instrumental in her family's economic enterprise. She's the one who like controls all of the money and she keeps all of the books. And then suddenly someone wants to marry her and she's like, "What? I don't want to marry you. I have all of this responsibility that I really enjoy." So it is incredible to me that in 1605, we have Cervantes giving us these demonstrations of how women can not only have will, but they can articulate it in very forceful ways to groups of men who are just, honestly, they're kind of stunned. Things are not always going super well for women in the book. And I don't think, it's not known as like a big feminist book, but I was so surprised by the strength of these women and by the force of their voices. It was really something in this read of the novel that I enjoyed so much. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of the elements that make this novel so modern, I want to just talk about the influence that it has had over the last 400 years. So again, this is the beginning of the 17th century. Fairly soon thereafter, in the 1700s, we have the Enlightenment, and we have, suddenly most things are essays. We do in the 18th century, beginning of that era, we have Jane Austen, who is just like such a trailblazer in so many ways. We also have some French writing. We have like Dangerous Liaison, but that is a novel that's epistolary. It's written in letters. So there's some novels that are written. I mean, it's not that like no one wrote a novel for several hundred years, but I think some of the elements that Don Quixote is introducing don't really get going until the beginning of the 19th century. So to backtrack a bit, we have the Enlightenment during the 1700s, during the 18th century. And then in the 19th century, we have the Romantic movement, which was, and like all that Gothic literature. And a lot of that looked back to the classics. So you have all the Romantic poets, which, oh my God, that was not an era of literature that I loved. So you have like, Yeats and Keats and all of the Grecian urn stuff. But a lot of that was like looking back to the classical era, meaning like Greek and Latin. And it was this real return to poetry. So, and there are some romantic novels, but not ones that are, really great examples. Although Frankenstein is a pretty cool example to think about in relationship to Don Quixote. But so then it's not until the middle of the 19th century when we have the publication of Madame Bovary by Flaubert, where we have this first realist novel. And for my money, the thing that is kind of most like the Quixote is the fact, it's an omniscient narrator for the most part in the realist novel, but it's a kind of a more democratizing thing. Novels before that, like Laclos, who wrote Dangerous Liaisons, or Jane Austen, lots of sort of drawing room and sort of upper crust kind of stuff. But now in the realist novel, we have all of the different classes kind of moving to the fore. There's still a lot of bigotry and still a lot of elitism, but we at least have like a depiction of them. So we have the realist novel in the United States. You can think of like Henry James, or you can think of Steinbeck or Mark Twain. And then we have, then the realist novel becomes the naturalist novel, which is basically just realism, but like with a social agenda, like Zola in France. So we have this idea of the realist novel and the naturalist novel. And then we have the First World War. And following that, we have modernism and the rise of really radical changes to the structure and the content of the novel. Think James Joyce, think Samuel Beckett, think Virginia Woolf, think Faulkner. So modernism, which is, you have stream of consciousness, things are changing in this radical way. That is not, in fact, very much in the vein of the Quixote. But for my money, in the 60s, and in the 70s, when you have the Latin American boom, so you have people like Borges, for example, and people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is taking, there is a lot of complexity in a book like 100 Years of Solitude that in many ways, is sort of an extension of some of what is happening in Don Quixote. And in the United States in the 60s and 70s, you're having postmodernism, where this idea of meta literature is really, really coming to the fore. These are a lot of like hyper-intellectual novels that are really playing with the idea of the novel and the idea of fiction and what fiction is meant to do. And that idea of like breaking the fourth wall, which in many ways is what that narrator is doing when he's like, hey guys, the way I have this manuscript is I found it in this town in Toledo. When we have that direct address on the part of the narrator, that's the kind of breaking of the fourth wall that postmodernism gets very interested in. So to kind of like wind up this idea of the trajectory of the novel and what happened. Also, this is my own kind of smattering of the books that I know. And in fact, like a very rough sense of the trajectory of the novel. But I want to end with this kind of list and this is a tiny, tiny list. In some ways, you could say that the Quixote, influences every novel that's written afterward. But we do know that it has an effect. We know that Shakespeare, because he wrote that play Cardenio, we know, in fact, that he knew of the book. But other people who are really notably influenced are Coleridge, for example, who's writing during that Romantic era. Flaubert himself, in fact, was very influenced by it. Dostoevsky in Russia, Kafka, certainly with all of that kind of meta stuff. Charles Dickens, you have this idea of the picaresque and the underdog. The picaresque is like a low-born person. It's often a young man, and they have all these different adventures. But you can see in lots of elements of Dickens the kind of crudeness. The debt to Don Quixote is just enormous. Somebody like Melville in the United States, famously, Nabokov was very influenced by it. Faulkner. I mean, honestly, the list goes on. And Borges, as I mentioned before, the list goes on and on and on. And in some ways, I'm hesitant to even give that list because it seems so paltry. I mean, again, it is such an incredibly influential book. So I'm going to finish kind of where I began, which is this idea that I'm not, this is not a book I'm going to recommend to everyone. It's just not. I mean, if you're into the concept and the idea of like a send-up of knights is really appealing to you, then I highly recommend it. I mean, it's just an incredible, incredible piece of literature. But what I think is most interesting in some ways is to really look at the elements of it that were so innovative and so incredible. Because when we are looking at those elements, it's also telling us about what it is we are looking for in a novel. And essentially like what a novel is doing, what it is made up of, how fiction functions. It's a very interesting sort of intellectual exercise. And I really love the idea of the book getting its due and the idea of the book as being this perennial favorite and this perennial classic and having such a wide reach. And I can't believe I'm going to end on this note, but I'm going to say read Don Quixote if you want to, but you definitely don't need to. Mostly, I hope that you've enjoyed this deep dive into all the ways that I think we really can think about it as the first modern novel. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.